Steve Harvey walked off the Family Feud stage after a contestant mocked a homeless player, and what happened next shattered the illusion of feel-good television. This wasn't a wardrobe malfunction or a technical glitch. This was a man named Marcus, who clawed his way out of 3 years on the streets, finally got his moment under the lights, and watched it turn into a public execution disguised as entertainment. What Steve did in response didn't just stop the show. It forced millions of people to choose between laughter and humanity. And when he walked back onto that stage, nothing would ever be the same. Marcus didn't look like someone who belonged on television. His face carried the kind of exhaustion that 3 years of homelessness etches into your bones. The sleepless nights in shelters where your shoes might get stolen, the mornings waking up on sidewalks where strangers step over you like you're part of the pavement. But somehow, defying every statistical probability, Marcus had made it onto Family Feud, and the journey to that stage was nothing short of a miracle wrapped in desperation. It started with a flyer. Marcus found it crumpled near a bus stop, advertising open auditions for the show. Most people would have thrown it away. Marcus folded it carefully and kept it in his pocket for 2 weeks, reading it over and over like it was a lottery ticket he couldn't afford to lose. His sister Nicole was the one who pushed him to go. She didn't have much, a cramped apartment, 2 kids, barely enough income to keep the lights on. But she believed in him with a ferocity that made him believe, just for a moment, that maybe he wasn't as invisible as the world had made him feel. But making it to the audition was only the beginning of an impossible climb. Marcus didn't own anything suitable to wear. The clothes on his back were donated, worn thin, stained with the evidence of survival. So Nicole's husband, James, lent him a button-down shirt that didn't quite fit, and Marcus borrowed a pair of slacks from a neighbor who asked too many questions. He practiced in the public library, whispering answers to imaginary survey questions, while librarians gave him suspicious looks. He studied the show like it was a final exam, memorizing Steve Harvey's cadence, the rhythm of the game, the way contestants who won always seemed confident, quick, unshaken. Marcus tried to become that person, even though every fiber of his being knew he was one wrong answer away from being dismissed. What the producers didn't see was the 3 years of hell Marcus had survived just to stand in that room. The audition was held in a hotel conference room that smelled like coffee and desperation. Hundreds of people showed up. Families in matching t-shirts, groups of friends who'd been planning this for months, people who treated the audition like a party. Marcus stood in line alone, his borrowed clothes feeling like a costume, his hands shaking so badly he had to shove them in his pockets. When his turn came, the producers barely looked up. They asked him the standard questions: name, occupation, why he wanted to be on the show. Marcus hesitated on the occupation part. What was he supposed to say? Homeless? Unemployed? Survivor? He said he was between jobs, which wasn't a lie, just an understatement of catastrophic proportions. The producers almost dismissed him. He could see it in their eyes, the quick glance at his worn shoes, the way they exchanged looks that said, "This guy doesn't have the energy we're looking for." But then Marcus did something that surprised even himself. He made them laugh. He cracked a joke about how he'd been practicing his survey answers so much that he'd started arguing with himself about whether chicken or pizza was the more popular answer for favorite food. The room softened. They asked him a few mock questions, and Marcus answered with a kind of sharp wit that homelessness hadn't managed to beat out of him. When they told him they'd be in touch, he didn't believe them. But 2 weeks later, Nicole called him, screaming into the phone that Family Feud had left a message. Marcus had been selected. He was going to be on the show. For Marcus, this wasn't about winning money. It was about proving he was still human. His family rallied around him like he'd just been drafted into the NBA. Nicole bought him a new shirt with money she didn't have. James drove him to the studio, a 3-hour trip that felt like crossing into another dimension. Marcus's niece and nephew made him a good luck card with crayons, and he kept it folded in his wallet like a talisman. They all believed this was his redemption story. The moment where Marcus would step into the lights, show the world his brilliance, win enough money to get back on his feet, maybe even inspire someone else who'd been knocked down by life. But there was something Marcus couldn't shake. A gnawing fear that America wouldn't let someone like him have this moment. He'd spent 3 years being invisible. 3 years of people crossing the street to avoid him. Of store owners watching him like he was about to steal something. Of strangers telling him to get a job, as if employment was something you could just pick up off the ground. He'd been mocked, spat on, told he was worthless so many times that the words had started to feel like truth. And now he was about to walk onto a stage in front of millions of people. And deep down, Marcus knew that not everyone watching would want him to win. Some people would see him and think he didn't deserve to be there. Some people would see him and feel uncomfortable that someone like him was allowed into their living rooms. The weight of 1,000 invisible nights pressed down on his chest as the production assistant called his name. This wasn't just a game show. It was a trial by fire. Marcus walked through the backstage corridors, past crew members adjusting lights and checking cameras, past other contestants who were laughing and taking selfies. And he felt like an imposter in a world that wasn't built for people like him. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might crack a rib. His palms were sweating. His mind was racing through every possible way this could go wrong. What if he froze? What if he gave a stupid answer? What if Steve Harvey looked at him with pity, or worse, with disgust? But then he heard his sister's voice in his head, the way she'd grabbed his shoulders the night before and told him he belonged there just as much as anyone else. He heard his nephew asking if Uncle Marcus was going to be on TV. The pure joy in that kid's voice. The belief that his uncle was about to do something incredible. And Marcus made a decision. He wasn't going to let fear steal this from him. Not after everything he'd survived. The stage manager gave him the signal. The lights were blinding. The audience was a wall of sound, applause, cheers, the kind of noise that makes your ears ring. And then Marcus stepped onto that stage. For one shining moment, he wasn't homeless. He wasn't the guy people pretended not to see. He wasn't the man who'd spent 3 years wondering if anyone would even notice if he disappeared. He was just a contestant. He was just a man. His family was in the audience, screaming his name like he'd just won the Super Bowl. The cameras were on him, but for once, being seen didn't feel like a threat. It felt like validation. Steve Harvey walked over, gave him that signature smile, shook his hand with genuine warmth. Steve asked him where he was from, what he did, the usual banner that makes Family Feud feel like a conversation instead of a competition. Marcus answered, kept it light, didn't mention the homelessness because this moment wasn't about his past. It was about his present. And for those first few minutes, everything felt possible. But then Marcus noticed something that made his stomach drop. Across the stage, on the opposing team, stood a man named Daniel. Tall, confident, the kind of guy who looked like he'd never had to borrow clothes for an audition. Daniel was watching Marcus with an expression that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't quite friendliness either. It was the look of someone sizing up an opponent, or maybe something worse. The look of someone who'd already decided Marcus didn't belong there. Their eyes met for just a second, and Marcus felt it. The shift in the air, The sense that this moment of dignity he'd fought so hard to claim was about to be tested in ways he hadn't prepared for. Steve Harvey introduced both families. The applause swelled again, and the game was about to begin. Marcus tried to focus, tried to hold on to the joy of just being there. But Daniel's gaze kept drifting back to him, and each time it did, Marcus felt a little more of his confidence crack. The audience didn't notice. The cameras didn't catch it. But Marcus knew. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of people who thought he was less than human, who thought someone like him didn't deserve to occupy the same space as them. And as Steve Harvey picked up the first question card, Marcus realized something that made his hands start to shake again. What Marcus didn't know was that his biggest battle wouldn't be answering the questions, it would be surviving what came next. The first question lit up the board, and Steve Harvey did what he always does. He brought the energy. His voice boomed through the studio with that perfect mix of charm and mischief, asking the families to name the most popular thing people forget when they leave the house. The audience leaned in. The lights blazed. The Family Feud magic that America had fallen in love with for decades filled every corner of that room. Marcus stepped up to the buzzer, and for a few beautiful minutes, everything felt normal. He slammed his hand down first, faster than Daniel, and the buzzer screamed in his favor. "Keys," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear. The board flipped, number 1 answer. His family erupted like he'd just hit a game-winning shot. His sister Nicole jumped out of her seat, screaming his name. His nephew was waving a homemade sign that said, "Go Uncle Marcus," in crooked letters. Steve Harvey grinned, gave Marcus a high five that felt genuine, and suddenly Marcus wasn't thinking about the 3 years he'd spent invisible. He was just playing a game, and he was winning. The next few rounds went smoothly. Marcus's family was on fire, answering questions about grocery store items, vacation destinations, things you'd find in a garage. They were funny, quick, exactly the kind of contestants that make Family Feud feel like a celebration instead of a competition. Steve was riffing with them, cracking jokes, doing that thing where he pretends to be shocked by an answer and stares into the camera with mock disbelief. The audience was laughing, the scoreboard was climbing, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe this really was his redemption story. But beneath the laughter, something darker was taking shape. Daniel's team was losing, and Daniel didn't seem like the kind of man who handled losing well. He stood at his podium with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, watching Marcus with an intensity that felt wrong for a game show. When it was Daniel's turn to answer, he was fine, charming even. He played to the crowd, made Steve laugh, hit a couple of decent answers. But every time the camera cut away, every time Steve turned his attention back to Marcus's family, Daniel's expression shifted into something colder. It started small, a comment that could have been banter, but landed just a little too sharp. Steve asked Daniel's team a question about things people wear to look professional, and when Daniel's cousin said a tie, Steve joked that Marcus's family better step up their game. Daniel laughed, looked over at Marcus, and said something about how Marcus's shirt looked like it had seen better days. Probably didn't need to worry about looking professional when you're just trying to look presentable, right? The audience gave a nervous chuckle, the kind of laugh that's half uncertain, half uncomfortable. Steve's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. But he moved on, redirecting the energy back to the game. Marcus felt the sting but swallowed it. It was just a joke. People made jokes. This was Family Feud. Banter was part of the deal. But then it happened again. A few rounds later, Steve asked a question about things people do while watching TV at home. Marcus's niece said, "Eat snacks," and the board lit up with another point. Daniel leaned into his microphone, loud enough for everyone to hear, and asked Marcus if he even had a TV to watch the show, or if he'd have to catch the rerun at a friend's place. He said it with a grin, like it was all in good fun, but the words hung in the air like a slap. What started as banter was beginning to feel like a public execution. The audience laughed again, but this time it was quieter, more fractured. Some people weren't sure if they were supposed to find it funny. Marcus's family went silent. Nicole's face hardened, and James looked like he wanted to jump out of his seat. Marcus forced a smile, tried to play it off, but his hands were gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles went white. Steve tried to redirect, but the cracks were already forming. Steve made a joke about Daniel needing to focus on his own answers instead of worrying about Marcus's TV situation. And the audience laughed, relieved to have the tension broken. But Steve's jaw was tight. You could see it in the way he held the question card, the way his eyes flicked between Daniel and Marcus, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. Steve Harvey had been hosting this show for years, had navigated every kind of awkward moment, every type of contestant. But this was different. This wasn't just competitive trash talk. This was cruelty wrapped in laughter, and Steve knew it. Marcus tried to ignore it, tried to stay focused on the game, but his confidence was crumbling in real time. His next answer came out hesitant, quieter than before. He second-guessed himself, stumbled over his words, and when the board didn't light up, Daniel's team erupted in exaggerated celebration. Daniel clapped Marcus on the shoulder as they passed each other, said something about how it was harder than it looked, wasn't it? The touch felt condescending, the words felt like mockery, and Marcus wanted to disappear. Marcus could feel it. The room was turning on him, one joke at a time. Not everyone, of course. His family was still cheering, still fighting for him. Parts of the audience were uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, exchanging glances that said, "This doesn't feel right." But there were others. People laughing a little too hard at Daniel's comments. People who seemed to enjoy watching Marcus squirm. People who'd maybe never wanted someone like him on their screens in the first place. The scoreboard was still close, but the energy had shifted. What had started as a joyful competition had become something uglier, something that felt less like a game and more like a test of how much humiliation Marcus could endure before he broke. Steve called for the next question, and the tension in the room was suffocating, because everyone on that stage knew where this was heading, but no one knew how to stop it. Daniel's team got control of the board, and they were playing well, racking up points, closing the gap. But Daniel wasn't satisfied with just winning. Every chance he got, he found a way to twist the knife. When Steve asked about things people save up money for, Daniel joked that Marcus's family probably had that category covered. They looked like experts in budgeting. When Marcus's nephew gave an answer that didn't make the board, Daniel laughed loud enough to make sure everyone heard, said something about how the kid was trying his best, just like his uncle. The audience's laughter was becoming more and more uncomfortable. Some people had stopped laughing altogether. Others were looking at the producers, as if waiting for someone to intervene, to tell Daniel to cool it, to remind everyone that this was supposed to be fun. For Steve, the bigger problem wasn't the jokes. It was the fact that nobody was stopping them. Steve had been in this industry long enough to know how these things worked. Controversy got ratings. Drama kept people watching. Producers loved conflict because conflict meant clips that would go viral, moments that would get replayed on social media, buzz that would keep Family Feud trending. But Steve also knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of cruelty, to be mocked for circumstances beyond your control, to have people treat your suffering like entertainment. He'd been homeless once. Not many people talked about it. But Steve Harvey had slept in his car for 3 years, trying to make it as a comedian, wondering if he'd ever get his shot. He knew what Marcus was feeling right now. The shame, the anger, the desperate need to prove you're more than the worst thing that ever happened to you. And watching Daniel turn Marcus's dignity into a punchline was making something dangerous rise up in Steve's chest. The game continued, but the room was a powder keg waiting for a match. Marcus's answers were getting quieter, his body language more defensive. His family was still trying to rally, but you could see the exhaustion setting in. The realization that no matter how well they played, Daniel was going to make sure Marcus left that stage feeling small. Then Steve made a decision. Daniel was in the middle of another comment. Something about how Marcus's family must be used to high-pressure situations, really knew how to stretch a dollar, that kind of thing. And Steve cut him off mid-sentence. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He just interrupted with a joke of his own, one sharp enough to be a warning. Steve said something about how Daniel seemed awfully worried about Marcus's finances for a guy who was losing on national television. And the audience erupted in laughter. Real laughter this time. The kind that releases tension instead of building it. Daniel's smile faltered. Steve held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary, and everyone in that studio understood what had just happened. Steve Harvey had just put Daniel on notice. The moment passed. The game continued. The audience settled back into their seats, relieved that the worst seemed to be over. But the damage was done. Marcus's hands were shaking. He was still standing at his podium, still playing the game, but something inside him had fractured. His sister was staring at Daniel with open hostility. His nephew had stopped waving his sign. The joy that had filled the first few rounds was gone, replaced by a grim determination to just get through this without falling apart on camera. And Daniel? Daniel was smirking. Not openly, not in a way the cameras would catch, but enough that Marcus could see it. Enough that Steve could see it. Daniel looked like a man testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before someone finally stopped him. Steve Harvey stood at the center of the stage, holding the next question card. And for the first time in his career, he looked like a man calculating whether to keep playing along or burn the whole thing down. The audience was watching. The cameras were rolling. The producers were probably thrilled with the drama unfolding in real time. But Steve's face had shifted into something nobody had seen before. Something caught between exhaustion and rage, between professionalism and the breaking point. He read the next question, but his voice had lost its usual warmth. But Daniel wasn't done, and what he said next would detonate everything. Steve Harvey stood at center stage, the question card held loosely in his hand. And for a brief second, it felt like maybe the worst was over. But Daniel had one more grenade to throw. The game was moving forward. The scoreboard showed Marcus's family still in the lead. And despite everything that had happened, despite the cruelty that had been seeping into every exchange, they were holding on. Marcus was gripping his podium, trying to focus, trying to block out the noise in his head that told him he didn't belong there. His sister Nicole was leaning forward in her seat, her hands clasped together like she was praying. His nephew had picked up the homemade sign again, waving it with the kind of innocent hope that didn't yet understand how ugly the world could be. The audience was settling back into the rhythm of the show, that familiar Family Feud energy where everything felt safe and predictable. Steve had managed to redirect the tension, had used his decades of experience to smooth over the rough edges, to make people believe that what they'd just witnessed was nothing more than competitive banter. The cameras were rolling. The lights were bright. The producers were probably breathing sighs of relief backstage, thinking the crisis had been averted. Marcus allowed himself to exhale. Maybe he could get through this. Maybe he could walk off that stage with his dignity intact, with his family proud, with proof that he was more than the 3 years he'd spent invisible. Then came the words that would shatter everything. Daniel leaned into his microphone, and what came out of his mouth wasn't banter. It wasn't a joke that crossed a line. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to humiliate Marcus in front of millions of people. Daniel said something about how Marcus must really need that prize money. Probably looking to upgrade from a tent to maybe a small RV, right? He said it with a laugh, like it was the funniest thing in the world. Then he kept going, asking if homeless people even belonged on family television, or if this was some kind of charity case situation that the producers thought would make for good ratings. He suggested that maybe Marcus should save everyone the trouble and just bow out now. Let a real family have their moment. The comment hung in the air like a death sentence. The studio went silent in a way that felt apocalyptic. Not the kind of silence where people are waiting for the next joke or holding their breath before applause. This was the silence of a room full of people realizing they'd just witnessed something unforgivable. The oxygen got sucked out of the space so fast it felt like the walls were closing in. Marcus froze. His hands went slack on the podium. His face drained of color. Every defense mechanism he'd built over 3 years of surviving on the streets. The ability to ignore insults, to keep moving when people spat at him, to pretend he didn't hear the cruel things strangers said. All of it shattered in that moment. Because this wasn't a stranger on a sidewalk. This was national television. This was a man standing 10 feet away, using Marcus's suffering as a punchline in front of cameras that would broadcast this humiliation to millions of homes. Marcus's world collapsed in real time, on national television, in front of millions. His sister Nicole's face crumbled. She looked like someone had reached into her chest and ripped her heart out. James was half out of his seat, his fists clenched, his face twisted in rage. Marcus's nephew didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel it. The way the air had turned toxic, the way his uncle had gone completely still, the way his mother was suddenly crying. The audience didn't know whether to gasp or laugh. A few nervous chuckles escaped from people who weren't sure if this was part of the show, if Daniel was playing some kind of character, if this was scripted drama designed to boost ratings. But most people just sat there, frozen in their seats, their faces reflecting the horror of what they'd just heard. And Steve Harvey. Steve Harvey stopped mid-sentence, the question card still in his hand, and the look on his face was something nobody had ever seen before. Steve Harvey's face shifted into something nobody had ever seen, something dangerous. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't shock. It was something deeper, something that came from a place most people didn't know existed in the man who'd spent decades making America laugh. It was rage, heartbreak, exhaustion, all colliding at once. It was the look of a man who'd been holding back a tidal wave of emotion for years, who'd smiled through his own pain, who'd played the game and followed the rules and kept the show moving no matter what, and had just reached the absolute limit of what he could tolerate. Steve's jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscles twitching. His eyes went dark. His entire body went rigid, like he was using every ounce of willpower to keep himself from doing something that would end his career on the spot. The question card trembled in his hand. For 3 seconds, maybe 5, nobody moved. The cameras kept rolling. The studio lights kept blazing. But time felt suspended, like the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what Steve Harvey would do next. And then Steve did the unthinkable. He put the card down, slowly, deliberately, placed it on the podium like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Then he looked at Daniel. Really looked at him, with an expression that made Daniel's smirk falter for the first time all day. Steve didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look said everything. It said you just crossed a line you can't come back from. It said, I know exactly who you are. It said you're going to regret this for the rest of your life. Then Steve looked at Marcus, and the rage in his eyes softened into something that looked like grief. Marcus was still frozen at his podium, his hands shaking, his eyes glistening with tears he was desperately trying not to let fall. Steve looked at him like he was looking at a younger version of himself. The version that had slept in his car, wondering if anyone would ever give him a chance, wondering if he'd ever be seen as anything more than his circumstances. Then Steve looked at the cameras, at the producers standing just off stage, at the audience that had laughed along with Daniel's cruelty, at the millions of people watching from home who would have to decide what they believed about all of this. And without saying a single word, Steve Harvey walked off the stage. The studio erupted into chaos. Producers came running from every direction, their headsets crackling with panicked voices, their faces pale with the realization that their multi-million-dollar show had just imploded in real time. Audience members were standing up, some of them shouting questions, others just staring in stunned silence. Camera operators didn't know where to point their lenses. At Steve's retreating back, at Marcus's devastated face, at Daniel, who was suddenly looking around like he'd just realized he might have destroyed more than Marcus's dignity. The stage manager was frantically trying to signal for a commercial break, but it was too late. This wasn't something you could cut away from. This wasn't a technical difficulty or a planned intermission. This was a complete and total meltdown of everything Family Feud was supposed to be. Marcus stood at his podium, and for a moment, he looked like he might collapse. His family was trying to get to him, but security was blocking the aisles, unsure of what protocol to follow when the host just walks off in the middle of taping. Nicole was screaming Marcus's name, trying to push past the confused production assistants. James was demanding to know what the hell was happening, if the show was over, if they were just going to let Daniel get away with what he'd said. And Marcus was wondering if he'd just lost everything. All the hope he'd carried into that studio, all the belief that this could be his redemption story, all the faith his family had placed in him. It felt like it was disintegrating in real time. He'd survived 3 years on the streets. He'd endured hunger, cold, violence, the soul-crushing weight of being invisible. But this public humiliation, this moment where his worst fear had come true and America had watched him get torn apart for entertainment, this felt like it might finally break him. Daniel was backing away from his podium, his confidence evaporating as he realized the magnitude of what he'd done. His own family members were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. One of his cousins was shaking her head, refusing to look at him. The audience's mood had turned completely. People were booing now, shouting at Daniel, demanding he apologize, calling him things that couldn't be broadcast. But the damage was already done. The wreckage of that moment was scattered across the stage like broken glass. Marcus's shattered dignity, Steve's abandoned podium, the question card lying face down where Steve had left it. The scoreboard still lit up with numbers that suddenly didn't matter anymore. Backstage, Steve Harvey was standing with his back against a wall, his eyes closed, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. Producers were surrounding him, begging him to come back, to finish the show, to fix this somehow. But Steve wasn't moving. For the first time in his decades-long career, Steve Harvey had walked away from a taping, and nobody knew if he was coming back. In the audience, Marcus's nephew was crying, asking his mother why everyone was yelling, why Uncle Marcus looked so sad, why the nice man with the mustache had left. Nicole was holding her son, trying to explain something she didn't understand herself, trying to find words that would make sense of cruelty that had no explanation. And in living rooms across America, millions of people were watching this unfold in real time, their phones already out, their social media feeds already exploding with reactions. Some people were defending Daniel, saying it was just a joke, that everyone was too sensitive, that Marcus should have known what he was signing up for. Others were calling for Daniel to be banned from television, for the show to be canceled, for someone to be held accountable. But in that moment, in the studio, with the cameras still rolling and the lights still blazing and the wreckage still settling, there was only one question that mattered. Was the show over? Marcus didn't know. Steve didn't know. The producers didn't know. The audience didn't know. All anyone knew was that something fundamental had just broken, not just on Family Feud, but in the contract between entertainment and humanity, between what we laugh at and what we're willing to defend. What happened next would define Steve Harvey's legacy and force America to confront the cruelty it had been laughing at for years. Backstage, Steve Harvey stood with his back pressed against a concrete wall, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling like he'd just survived a car crash. And in a way, he had. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit, nothing like the blazing stage he'd just abandoned. But it felt safer here, away from the cameras, away from the audience, away from the wreckage of what Family Feud had just become. But Steve wasn't moving, and the longer he stayed silent, the more the network panicked. Producers were swarming him like wasps around a hive that had just been kicked over. They were talking over each other, their voices climbing in pitch and desperation, their headsets crackling with instructions from control rooms and executive offices. One of them was saying they could cut to commercial, edit this out, pretend it never happened. Another was begging Steve to just go back, finish the episode, deal with Daniel later. A third was already on the phone with legal, trying to figure out if walking off mid-taping violated Steve's contract, if the network could sue, if this entire disaster could somehow be contained. The network was in full meltdown mode. But Steve wasn't listening to any of them. His eyes were still closed, his jaw still clenched, and the silence radiating off him was more terrifying than any explosion could have been. Because Steve Harvey didn't lose his composure. Steve Harvey didn't walk off stages. Steve Harvey was the man who could handle anything, the wrong answer envelopes, the awkward contestants, the technical difficulties, and turn it all into comedy gold. But right now, Steve Harvey looked like a man who'd reached the absolute end of what he could tolerate. Steve's silence was a weapon. One of the senior producers, a woman named Janet who'd been with the show since the beginning, finally pushed through the crowd and stood directly in front of Steve. She didn't beg. She didn't panic. She just waited until Steve opened his eyes and looked at her. Then she asked him quietly what he needed. What would it take to get him back on that stage? Steve's voice, when it finally came, was so low the other producers had to stop talking just to hear it. He said he needed a minute. Just 1 minute to think. To figure out if he could go back out there and pretend this was fine, pretend that what Daniel had done was just part of the show. Pretend that Marcus's humiliation was acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of entertainment. For Steve, the bigger problem wasn't the comment. It was the years of complicity that led to it. Steve had been hosting Family Feud for over a decade. He'd seen every kind of contestant, the funny ones, the awkward ones, the competitive ones, the ones who froze under pressure. And he'd seen the way producers sometimes pushed boundaries, encouraged conflict, Let things get a little messy because messy made for good television. He'd gone along with it because that was the job. You kept the energy up. You played along. You made people laugh even when things got uncomfortable. But somewhere along the way, the line between uncomfortable and cruel had gotten blurred. And Steve had been too focused on keeping the show running, keeping the ratings high, keeping everyone happy, to notice when that line got crossed completely. What the audience didn't know was that Steve had lived this nightmare before. Not as a host. As the victim, Steve Harvey had been homeless. Not many people talked about it anymore. It didn't fit the narrative of the successful comedian, the best-selling author, the Family Feud icon. But before any of that, Steve had spent 3 years sleeping in his car, showering in gas station bathrooms, wondering if he'd ever get his shot at success or if he'd die invisible and forgotten. He remembered what it felt like to walk into a room and see people's faces change when they realized he was poor. He remembered the jokes people made, thinking he couldn't hear them, or worse, thinking he could and not caring. He remembered auditioning for comedy clubs and having bookers dismiss him because his clothes were wrinkled, because he looked tired, because poverty had a smell and a look that people in power didn't want anywhere near their stages. And he remembered the few people who'd seen past all of that. The ones who'd given him a chance, who treated him like a human being instead of a cautionary tale, who'd believed he was more than his circumstances. Steve had built his entire career on being one of those people, on lifting others up, on making space for contestants who didn't fit the usual mold, on treating everyone who stepped onto his stage with dignity and respect, no matter where they came from. And he'd just watched Daniel strip all of that away from Marcus in less than 30 seconds. This wasn't about a game show anymore. This was about whether Steve Harvey could look at himself in the mirror. The producers were still talking, still trying to figure out how to salvage the taping. But Steve wasn't hearing them anymore. He was thinking about Marcus standing at that podium, his hands shaking, his face drained of color, his entire world collapsing in real time. He was thinking about Marcus's family, his sister who'd believed in him, his nephew who'd made him a good luck sign, the people who'd rallied around Marcus because they knew he deserved this moment. And he was thinking about all the people watching from home, the ones who'd been homeless or poor or marginalized in ways that made them feel invisible. The ones who'd seen themselves in Marcus, who'd been rooting for him, who'd allowed themselves to hope that maybe someone like them could have a moment of joy on national television. What would it say to those people if Steve just went back out there and finished the show like nothing had happened? What would it say if he smiled and joked and let Daniel get away with it because stopping the show was too inconvenient, too expensive, too risky for the network? The decision forming in Steve's mind would either destroy his career or define his legacy. He could go back. He could smooth this over. He could make a joke that defused the tension, redirect the energy, finish the taping, and let the editors figure out how to make this palatable for broadcast. The network would be relieved. The producers would praise his professionalism. His contract would be safe. Everything would go back to normal. But normal was the problem. Normal was what had allowed Daniel to think his comments were acceptable. Normal was what had turned human suffering into entertainment. Normal was what had made Marcus's humiliation feel like just another day on Family Feud. And Steve was done with normal. On the stage, Marcus was surrounded by his family. Nicole had finally gotten past security and was holding her brother, whispering things nobody else could hear. James was standing guard, glaring at anyone who came too close. Marcus's nephew was clutching his uncle's leg, confused and scared, but refusing to let go. Marcus felt like his dignity was bleeding out on national television. He'd known this was a risk. He'd known that stepping into the spotlight meant exposing himself to judgment, to cruelty, to people who would see his homelessness as a character flaw instead of a circumstance. But he'd hoped, he'd hoped, that maybe this time would be different. That maybe Family Feud, with its wholesome reputation and its celebration of ordinary families, would be a safe place. That maybe Steve Harvey, who seemed so genuine, so kind, would protect him. And for a while, it had felt like that hope was justified. Steve had been warm, welcoming, had treated Marcus like any other contestant. But then Daniel had started talking, and the protection Marcus thought he had evaporated like smoke. Now Marcus was standing in the ruins of his redemption story, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life by believing he deserved to be here. Across the stage, Daniel was having his own crisis. His face had drained of all color. His family members were refusing to look at him. The audience's boos were still echoing in his ears. And slowly, horribly, Daniel was beginning to understand that he'd just destroyed more than Marcus's moment. He'd destroyed his own future. Daniel had thought he was being funny. He'd thought the audience would laugh, that Steve would play along, that mocking Marcus would make him look clever and confident. But the silence that had followed his comments, the look on Steve's face, the way the entire studio had turned against him, Daniel was realizing, too late, that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His hands were shaking, his mouth was dry. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was screaming that he needed to apologize, needed to fix this, needed to do something before this moment defined the rest of his life. But it was already too late for that. Backstage, Steve finally opened his eyes and looked at Janet. The senior producer was still standing there, patient, waiting for his answer. The other producers had gone quiet, sensing that whatever Steve said next would determine everything. Steve took a breath. Then he said he was going back. But not to finish the show the way they wanted. Not to pretend this was fine, not to smooth it over, not to protect the network's investment at the expense of Marcus's humanity. And then Steve made a choice that terrified everyone in that building. He was going back to say what needed to be said, consequences be damned. He was going to talk about homelessness, about dignity, about the cruelty that gets disguised as entertainment. He was going to call out Daniel, call out the culture that made Daniel think his comments were acceptable, and call out everyone, including himself, who'd been complicit in creating that culture. Janet's face went pale. She tried to explain that going off script like that could violate his contract, could get the episode pulled, could damage his relationship with the network. Other producers were jumping in, saying they needed to think this through, needed to talk to legal, needed to consider the ramifications. But Steve was already walking toward the stage. His decision was made, and the look on his face was something nobody had seen before. A mixture of fear and determination, of exhaustion and resolve. Of a man who'd finally decided that some things were more important than keeping everyone comfortable. The entire studio held its breath like a bomb was about to go off. The audience saw Steve first. He emerged from backstage, walking slowly, deliberately, and the murmur of confused conversations died instantly. People sat up straighter. Camera operators swung their lenses toward him. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to figure out if they should keep rolling or cut the feed entirely. Marcus looked up and saw Steve coming back. For a moment, hope flickered across his face. Maybe this meant everything was okay. Maybe the show would continue. Maybe his moment wasn't completely destroyed. But then Marcus saw Steve's expression, and the hope transformed into something else. Into recognition. into the understanding that whatever was about to happen, it was going to be big. Daniel saw Steve too, and the last of his bravado crumbled. He looked like a man watching his execution approach in slow motion. Steve walked to the center of the stage. He didn't pick up the question card. He didn't look at the scoreboard. He just stood there, in front of the cameras, in front of the audience, in front of Marcus and Daniel, and everyone who'd witnessed what had just happened. And then Steve Harvey began to speak. What Steve said next would be replayed millions of times, and it would change everything. Steve Harvey stood at center stage, and the audience erupted like a dam breaking. Some people were applauding, thunderous, relieved applause that said, "Thank God you came back." Others were confused, whispering to their neighbors, trying to figure out what was happening, whether the show was continuing or if this was something else entirely. A few were silent, watching Steve with the kind of intensity that comes from knowing you're about to witness something that will be remembered long after the cameras stop rolling. But Steve didn't pick up where he left off. What he did, instead, would shock the world. He didn't reach for the question card that was still lying on the podium where he'd abandoned it. He didn't look at the scoreboard. He didn't make a joke to break the tension or flash that signature smile that had made him one of the most beloved hosts in television history. Instead, Steve Harvey stood in the center of that stage, looked directly into the cameras, and did something unprecedented in the history of Family Feud. He spoke directly to everyone watching about what had just happened. Steve's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something raw and unfiltered that made every person in that studio lean forward. He said he needed to address what had just occurred, because pretending it didn't happen, moving on like it was just another moment of game show drama, would make him complicit in something he could no longer stomach. Steve's words cut through the studio like a blade. He talked about dignity, about what it means to be human, about the difference between comedy that brings people together and cruelty that tears them apart. He said that Family Feud had always been about celebrating families, about giving ordinary people a moment to shine, about making everyone feel welcome regardless of where they came from or what they'd been through. And what had just happened on this stage was the antithesis of everything the show was supposed to represent. The audience was completely silent now. Not the uncomfortable silence from before, but the kind of silence that comes when people are hearing truth spoken in a place where they didn't expect it. Steve said he'd spent his entire career trying to make people laugh, trying to bring joy into living rooms across America, trying to create moments where families could gather around their televisions and just enjoy something together. But he'd learned something over the years. Laughter built on someone else's suffering wasn't laughter at all. It was cruelty wearing a smile. And he was done being a part of that. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a trial, and Daniel was on the stand. Steve turned to face Daniel directly, not with rage. Rage would have been easier, would have given Daniel something to defend against. Instead, Steve looked at him with the kind of moral clarity that cut deeper than any insult. The kind that made you see yourself clearly for the first time and hate what you found there. Steve asked Daniel if he understood what he'd just done. Not the surface level, not just that he'd made an inappropriate comment or crossed a line on a game show. But did Daniel understand that he'd taken a man who'd survived 3 years of homelessness, who'd fought his way onto this stage against impossible odds, who'd brought his family here with hope and dignity intact, and tried to strip all of that away for a cheap laugh? Daniel's face was ashen. He tried to speak, stumbled over words that wouldn't come. Steve didn't let him off the hook. Steve talked about his own years of homelessness, and the audience gasped. Some of them knew his story had been told before, in interviews and books. But hearing it here, in this context, made it real in a way it had never been before. Steve described sleeping in his car, showering in gas stations, performing at comedy clubs, and then having nowhere to go afterward except back to that car. He talked about the shame of it, the exhaustion, the way people looked through him like he didn't exist. The question Steve asked next would haunt Daniel for the rest of his life. Steve asked Daniel if he'd ever been invisible, if he'd ever stood on a street corner and watched hundreds of people walk past without acknowledging his existence, if he'd ever been so hungry that he had to choose between eating and putting gas in his car, if he'd ever had someone mock his suffering and turn it into entertainment while he stood there powerless to defend himself. Daniel couldn't answer. His mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. His family members were staring at the floor. The audience was watching him with expressions that ranged from pity to disgust. Steve said he didn't need Daniel to answer because he already knew. Daniel had never experienced any of that. Daniel had probably never spent a single day of his life wondering if he mattered, if anyone would care if he disappeared, if he'd ever get a chance to prove he was more than his worst circumstances. And that was exactly why Daniel thought his comments were funny. Because when you've never been invisible, you don't understand what it costs to finally be seen. Then Steve turned to Marcus, and everyone realized this moment would define all of them. Marcus was still standing at his podium, his sister's arm around his shoulders, tears streaming down his face. He looked like a man who'd been broken open, every defense stripped away, every wound exposed for millions of people to see. Steve walked over to him slowly, and the cameras followed, capturing every step. Steve asked Marcus if he wanted to continue. He said it quietly, gently, making it clear that whatever Marcus decided would be respected. If Marcus wanted to walk away, if this had been too much, if he needed to protect himself from any more cruelty, Steve would understand. They all would. The studio held its breath. This was the moment that would determine everything. Whether Marcus would let Daniel's cruelty have the final word, or whether he'd find the strength to keep going. What Marcus said next, through tears, through humiliation, through everything, would break hearts and restore faith at the same time. Marcus said yes. His voice was shaking, barely above a whisper, but it was clear. Yes, he wanted to continue. Because walking away would mean Daniel won. Walking away would mean the 3 years Marcus had spent surviving, the hope his family had placed in him, the belief that he deserved this moment. All of it would have been for nothing. Marcus said he'd spent too long being invisible to let someone make him disappear now. The audience erupted again, but this time it was different. This wasn't polite applause or nervous laughter. This was something primal. People standing up, cheering, crying, responding to Marcus's courage with a kind of raw emotion that doesn't happen on game shows. His sister was sobbing. His nephew was jumping up and down. Even some of the crew members were wiping their eyes. And then something extraordinary happened. Steve picked up the question card. The game resumed. But it wasn't the same game anymore. Every question that Steve read felt weighted with meaning. Every answer that Marcus's family gave was an act of defiance against the cruelty that had tried to break them. The scoreboard kept climbing, but the numbers felt secondary to what was actually happening. The restoration of dignity on a scale nobody expected. The moment became sacred. Marcus's family was playing with a focus and determination that transcended competition. They weren't just trying to win money. They were proving that they belonged there, that Daniel's comments were lies, that their humanity couldn't be taken away by someone else's cruelty. When they got an answer right, the celebration felt like victory over something much bigger than a game show question. Daniel's team had to keep playing too. and it was excruciating to watch. Every time one of them stepped up to the podium, you could see the shame on their faces. They were playing mechanically, joylessly, knowing that no matter what happened with the score, they'd already lost something far more important. Steve guided them through it with a professionalism that was almost superhuman. He didn't mock Daniel's team. He didn't make jokes at their expense. He just kept the game moving, kept the focus on Marcus and his family, kept creating space for redemption to happen in real time. And Marcus transformed before everyone's eyes. The man who'd been frozen with humiliation 20 minutes ago was answering questions with confidence now. His hands had stopped shaking. His voice had gotten stronger. Every answer he gave felt like he was reclaiming pieces of himself that Daniel had tried to steal. The final round came down to Marcus. One question, one answer, and his family would win. The audience was on its feet. Steve read the question, something about what people are most grateful for in life. And Marcus didn't hesitate. He said family. The board lit up. Number one answer. The studio exploded. Marcus's family rushed the stage, surrounding him, lifting him up, celebrating in a way that felt like more than just winning a game show. It felt like survival, like vindication, like proof that cruelty doesn't get to have the final word if you refuse to give it that power. Steve handed Marcus the check, and everyone watching understood this wasn't about the money anymore. The money would help. God knows Marcus needed it, would use it to get back on his feet, to rebuild his life. But that wasn't what this moment was about. This was about Steve Harvey looking Marcus in the eyes and saying, "You matter." This was about Marcus's family surrounding him and saying, "We believe in you." This was about an audience of strangers standing up and saying, "We see you." This was about refusing to let someone's humanity be erased for entertainment. Steve shook Marcus's hand, pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than the usual congratulatory embrace, and whispered something that the cameras didn't catch. Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face again. But this time, they were different tears. These were the tears of someone who'd been seen, valued, defended when he was most vulnerable. The episode ended. The cameras stopped rolling. But the impact of what had just happened was only beginning. The clip detonated across the internet within hours. Someone in the audience had recorded Steve's speech on their phone, and it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, every corner of social media where people gathered to talk about moments that mattered. The video had millions of views before the official episode even aired. The national conversation exploded. People were dissecting every moment, every word, every expression on Steve's face when he'd made the decision to walk off and then walk back. Think pieces were written about dignity and entertainment, about the line between comedy and cruelty, about what hosts owe their contestants and what audiences owe the people they watch. Daniel tried to issue an apology, but it was hollow and nobody believed it. He released a statement saying he'd been caught up in the competition, that his comments were meant as jokes, that he never intended to hurt anyone. But the statement felt like damage control, like words written by a lawyer instead of coming from genuine remorse. The internet tore it apart. Daniel's social media accounts were flooded with condemnation. His employer put him on leave. His future became a question mark defined by the worst moment of his life. But Marcus became something else entirely. He used his platform to advocate for the homeless. He did interviews, told his story, talked about the 3 years he'd spent invisible and what it meant to finally be seen. He partnered with shelters and organizations, used his prize money to help others who were still fighting the same battles he'd survived. He became a voice for people who'd been silenced, a face for people who'd been ignored. And Steve Harvey's legacy was forged in that moment, not in laughter, but in courage. People had always loved Steve for his comedy, his warmth, his ability to make Family Feud feel like a celebration. But after that episode, Steve became something more. He became the man who'd walked off a stage to defend someone's humanity, who'd risked his career to say that some things matter more than ratings, who'd proven that dignity isn't negotiable no matter how much money is at stake. The network tried to edit the episode, to soften some of Steve's words, to make it more palatable for broadcast. But Steve refused. He said if they cut his speech, he'd walk away from the show entirely. So they aired it as it happened, raw, unfiltered, real. The ratings were massive. The episode became the most watched Family Feud in history. But more than that, it became a cultural moment. The kind of thing people remembered years later. The kind of thing that changed conversations about how we treat each other, about what we're willing to tolerate in the pursuit of entertainment. Marcus's family framed the check, hung it on their wall alongside the photo of them on stage with Steve. But the real prize wasn't the money. It was the moment Marcus's nephew looked up at him and said he was proud to have him as an uncle. It was Nicole telling him she always knew he'd do something extraordinary. It was Marcus looking at himself in the mirror and seeing someone who'd survived, who'd fought back, who'd refused to let cruelty define him. Years later, people would still talk about the episode where Steve Harvey walked off the stage. They'd debate whether he'd overreacted, whether he'd been right to stop the show, whether his speech had been too much or exactly what was needed. But for Marcus, for his family, for everyone who'd ever been invisible and desperate to be seen, there was no debate. Steve Harvey had done what so few people in power ever do. He'd used his platform not to protect himself, but to defend someone who couldn't defend themselves. He'd risked everything to say that dignity matters, that humanity matters, that some lines can't be crossed without consequences. And in doing so, Steve had proven that the most important moments in life aren't the ones where we make people laugh. They're the ones where we make people matter.